All right. Well, it looks like it is 2 p.m., so we will go ahead and get started with today's webinar. First and foremost, we want to say thank you for joining us at the Belonging Project in our webinar series. Today, we will be presenting the finishing touches, revisiting, editing, and proofreading your own work. And this presentation will be brought to you by Julie Schrager. So just a little bit about Julie before we get into her actual presentation, and she will also give you a little background on the Belonging Project. So Julie is passionate about teaching writing to a wide range of audiences and has worked as Chip Hardin's in-house legal writing coach for 12 years. Julie graduated from Harvard College in 1986 and the University of Chicago Law in 1989. After graduation, she worked as an associate in the litigation and legislation practice areas at Arnold and Porter in Washington, D.C., and as an assistant United States attorney in the Civil Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. Julie taught legal writing full-time at Chicago-Kent College of Law for several years before she joined Schiff and continues to teach there periodically. And before I turn this over to Julie, I just wanted to let everybody know that we will have the Q&A open for any comments or questions that you might have throughout the presentation, and we will address those as they come in. So Julie, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you to everyone who is here today to talk about revising, editing, and proofreading your own work. First, a few words about the Belonging Project. So if today is your first webinar, I would urge you to look on the website and find all the other great webinars and other resources that the Belonging Project has put out over the course of these last almost 6 months of the pandemic. So the Belonging Project was set up by Seyfarth and has a number of amazing co-sponsors to help diverse lawyers and law students weather this pandemic and gain the tools and understanding and mentorship and trainings that anyone might need to be successful. It is built around the understanding that if we are not for all of us, then we are not for any of us. So it's an incredibly fabulous, inclusive project, and I'm really excited to be doing my second webinar this summer, and who knows, maybe more to come if it goes on at some point and you all have additional writing questions. So today, first, I want to encourage you, like Whitney said, please toss out into the chat function your questions, your comments throughout. I'm not going to intentionally save time at the end. So start talking to me whenever you'd like to start talking to me. So many of you throughout high school and college, and I know this because I went to high school and college and law school, and I've also had my older daughter who's gone through this. Many of you would finish a paper, usually at the last minute, and you'd sort of look at it, you'd be like, oh, it's the right length, I'm going to hit send. I didn't get to do that in college because we didn't have computers for some of my college experience. So you didn't spend a lot of time on the process of revising, editing, and proofreading. So I'm here to tell you today, and Laura, you can go to the next slide, that that's really the most important part of the process. I like this one because I feel like Dorothy Parker a lot of days with her, arms clenched around her body. So she was a famous American writer, satirist, poet, and she and others, as you'll see, have really great statements about the significance of revising to your own work. So what you need to know is that a first draft for anyone, even the most famous authors, is not a final draft. All it is a first draft. What I would urge you to do when you are putting together a first draft is think really hard about the structure of what you're writing. Get that down on paper, and then consider that you will be open to revising and changing anything else. No one writes a great first draft, including one of our favorite young adult authors who has written 7 novels over the course of the last 15 years. Laura, you can go to the next slide, and talks about his first draft as his vomit draft is his word. So Not in this quote, but in many others. So if you think, John Green is a good writer, it means that he obviously spends a ton of time revising and editing and proofreading as well. So give yourself permission to not be great at the outset. That permission will also help you get over the anxiety associated with getting started. And that's a huge obstacle to many of us. People tell me all the time, oh, well, I just didn't have time to revise this piece of work. That's because they didn't start early enough. And it's not usually because they're just procrastinators. It's usually because they thought, oh, I'm not going to get it right. I'm worried if it isn't good enough. I'm not exactly sure what I want to say. So I want to urge you, you got to get started early so that you have time for this revision process. Okay, it also helps you get over your writer's block there. So the biggest issue here, and I was thinking about this when my older daughter, who's now 23, learned to, I remember her first, it was like a pre-ballet class at our local recreation center. And the teacher was talking about how to skip. And all the other girls could just watch the teacher and, she was skipping like most of us know how to do. And they could just do it. And I remember thinking my daughter couldn't do it based on just watching the teacher and the other girls. But when I articulated the process and said, you take a step and then you hop, and then you take a step with your other foot and then you hop, she could figure it out that way. So what it made me realize is there's so many things that nobody teaches us how to do. They just assume that we're going to pick it up by watching other people or by, getting it from the air. So I think that's a lot of what people assume about revising your own work. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think it's intuitive. And I think that's why we really need to spend time on it today. So this is maybe the most important slide of the presentation. When you are starting to think about editing your own work, what I want you to do is to see the process as 3 distinct steps. And this way, when you take them as 3 separate steps, you don't jump ahead to the final step when you're still at the first step. You will have a process for your editing that's going to make the whole situation easier, and I guarantee you will lead to a better final product. The other thing is having a process, I think we all know this too, is another thing to reduce anxiety about it. When you just kick into like, this is what I'm going to do, it's a lot easier than overthinking it each time. So we're going to take it as a big picture revising, then we're going to get to smaller picture editing, and then we're going to get to the smallest picture, and that's proofreading at the end. Okay, so when you are thinking about the big picture revising, you need to get out of your head, and your head is the mindful head on the left of the screen, where you got all the facts and the law and everything you were thinking about in your head, and you want to get out of that head and into a peaceful place where you can see your document from the perspective of the reader. Okay, that is the fundamentally most important thing to big picture editing. So you were asking yourself some big questions at the outset, and that big picture question is, what does my reader need from me? Right? What does my reader need to know? What does my reader know already? What have I been asked to do? And I guess even before that, you got to ask yourself who is reading it, right? Because you write differently for different readers. So don't get deterred. This is the longest slide we have out there. I'm not asking you to read it too much. So the most important part of any document that you're going to write is the introduction. In longer documents, you will have a formal introduction like this one. I have a general rule that your introduction can be 10% of the length of the memo or brief that you're writing. And I have another general rule, which is it shouldn't take your reader more than 30 seconds to get into anything that you're writing. So you're looking at the big picture reader's needs here. I think most of you don't have to read it super carefully, will see that like you're just sort of getting bogged down, right? In that first paragraph, there's just lots and lots of words. And you can't really tell what the issue is in this case. So this was a memo that someone wrote at Schiff as a summer associate, answering a question about whether the Fifth Circuit or the Eighth Circuit had better reasoning on this Clean Air Act requirement. So you're asking if your writing will meet the reader's needs. That's the biggest picture question you ask. This one feels like, maybe not. Another thing that you want to look at when you're thinking about meeting the reader's needs is you've got one read for people to do. We all know how frustrating it is when you have to read something more than once to understand it. So one way to make things clearer, and we're going to get into this more later, that whole second paragraph is one sentence and 47 words, which is about 20 words too long for a sentence. All right, let's go to the after slide, which I will just highlight a few things. So the first sentence here is setting out the context for the question that you're answering. You always want the right amount of context in what you're writing. So for example, you're filing a motion history of Rule 56 and how it's changed over time and how the federal rules of civil procedure were established originally, or any of that kind of deep background, but you're going to have to cite to the rule. You're going to have to say the words of the rule. So you have to include enough context for your reader to understand. So here, that's the first sentence. The second sentence asks the question that you were asked to answer. And then the third sentence explains the reasons. And it's still a little bit long for my taste, but it's divided up by numbers. Another one of my absolutely favorite techniques for making your writing clear to your reader. So a reader would look at this and be like, oh, great, there are 3 reasons that she reached her conclusion. I'm like cool with that. And it sets out probably how you're going to organize what comes next. Okay, after that, you're also going to ask yourself when you're doing this big picture editing, is my tone, that's okay, Laura, let's go to the next one. Is my tone appropriate for my audience? So tone means everything from, are you too formal or too informal? Are you writing something that's persuasive or descriptive? And you all know the difference between that. You're writing something to convince a court or some other kind of arbiter of something, or you're writing to explain to someone. So, and you want to make sure that what you're writing is the right level of formal versus informal. I feel like younger, newer lawyers get a bad rap for writing informally, when in my experience, I actually see people write more formally than is necessary. So this slide illustrates something I see all the time, which is that people think using legal jargon and all these words that you never used in your life, I hope you never used them in your life before you were a lawyer, are somehow the right tone and the right form of writing now that you're a law student and lawyer. So I'm here to tell you they are not. If there are words in what you're writing that existed, 150 years ago, you probably shouldn't continue to use them. So that's not to say you don't use legally precise language, but we don't use words like this. So we don't, some examples of the challenge in this before. You've got a bunch of words that you never would have used, right? For the foregoing reasons. As such is almost always imprecise and should be taken out of your writing altogether. Aforementioned sounds, I don't even know what it sounds like. And then the other 2 examples should be allowed is an example of passive voice. We'll talk more about active later. And inquiring of is just extra words. So the after here illustrates how simple it is really to get your tone right, to be legally precise, but not full of legal jargon that actually confuses what you're writing. So you're saying for these reasons instead of the foregoing reasons, there wouldn't be reasons anywhere other than before. So for these reasons captures your meaning. The court should grant. You always want to put your readers in your writing. It will always make it clearer and more precise. Specifically can almost always be swapped out for as such because you're explaining something, you're expanding on it. And then at the end, I'm just restating the federal action instead of the aforementioned federal action. It seems like that would be clear from the context. So to the extent you all like these examples, we are going to share the PowerPoint afterwards so you can have some examples of how things can get better. 2 ways, 2 additional just words that I can't stand that you can use to make your writing and your tone better. Swap out prior to for before. Always, it saves you a word, and before is a much clearer word anyway. Swap out subsequent to for after. I can guarantee you everyone you're writing for knows before and after, and it makes your writing much smoother at the time. So another step in your big picture editing is to ask yourself the question, is my document well organized? So we're going to talk about the question at the outset and how clearly you state it, and then we're going to talk about headings and how you can use them to lead your readers through your document. Okay, so what I often find is that people try to squeeze maybe too much into a single question to set out what it is that their document is going to do and how it's organized. So here, this was a memo also written by a summer associate. Our attorney prepared documents protected by either one of these 2 privileges. So super great question, very classic at a law firm. And this isn't an awful question before, but you want the right amount of context in what you're writing. So if we look at the after, so one thing I want to encourage you all to do, unless you work in a place where you absolutely know 100% that people hate this, when you say you asked me to research, you make it really clear that you're on the same page as the person who gave you the assignment, which is a great way of being attentive to your reader. You want them to know that you are thinking about them when you are writing. You also want to take responsibility for the work that you're doing. So this rewrite has not just a question, it has a statement of the question in a statement format, and then it has the answer to what it is you were asked to do. So again, that great word specifically and analyzed is a really good and precise verb that shows exactly what you did that the reader asked you. So you're gonna have your introduction. In some documents, you'll have a question and an answer. These are all big picture setups for what is going to come next. So when you're asking yourself if your document's well organized, I want you to look at your heading. We can go to the next example. Oh, I'm sorry. First, I want you to hear what James Baldwin says about editing. And if you want some incredible quotes about writing and life, you don't have to look any further than James Baldwin. So this one is the sentence that I want on my t-shirt that I'm going to order after I get off this webinar about you want to write a sentence that is clean as a bone. Okay, so that's what we're looking for as we're going here. He also actually, this is a side point, has a lot about not over editing. At some point, you have to let it out of your hands and you have to just say, this is good to go. I am so bad at that. Laura, my colleague, who's our professional development specialist, Schiff, can tell you how many times I revise every presentation that I do. So I need to learn from James Baldwin about that as well. All right, next, headings. So headings are another really important part of your organizational structure. If you are writing anything long, and by that I would say more than 6 to 8 pages, you should divide up what you're writing with your headings. My general rule is that you want to have headings every 2 to 3 pages. And the best headings are just 1 to 2 lines. If they're starting to get longer, that's a sign usually that you need subheadings in the section where you're doing it. So like that introduction and meeting the 1 read rule, headings should absolutely be something people, a court, a partner can just blow by and get your story without reading too carefully. Okay, So this example also illustrates some of my favorite writing techniques. So the first one goes on for an awfully long time. And so my brother used to be a TV news guy, and one of their rules on the screen is you couldn't have a sentence that was too long and that you needed to take a breath in the middle of it. So sometimes I use it now to test myself to see if my sentences are too long. So I think this first one would have me gasping a little bit, and you don't want anyone gasping when they're reading your headings. A couple other things that make it unclear and hard to get through. So for those of you who aren't big grammar people, and I'm not a big grammar person either, everything that comes before the verb in your sentence is called the subject of the sentence. We're putting aside clauses or anything like that. So it's everything that comes before the verb is the thing that is doing the verb. So in a sentence like this one, in the before, you have lack of support and lack of mention in case law, which is a whole lot of words before that verb. So lots of words before a verb makes a sentence hard to follow. When you have a lot of negatives, like lack of support and lack of mention, and then a positive like suggests, and then another negative like there is no causation, it makes sentences wind all around and makes it really hard for your reader to figure out like, is there or isn't there? So those are both things that you want to be avoiding. So the second one has a 4-word subject, the Clean Air Act. That's what this is about anyway. Likely does not require, and it puts plaintiffs, the people who you're talking about, in your writing. And it's a lot shorter. Okay, so you're wanting your writing to be well organized. That means clear headings. If you're writing something that's smaller, that's shorter than 6 to 8 pages, and you might not need headings, but instead of headings, you're going to be really focused on the first sentences of each paragraph that you're using. Those are sort of what you swap headings out for when you're writing something shorter. And I think of that all the time when I'm writing email memos as well, because I think a lot of people just blow through those first sentences to get to your points. Okay, all right, next we're going to move on to the second phase of our revising, editing, and proofreading. So I think I've said revising are the big pictures. Does your document meet your reader's goals? Right tone, right audience, organization, great introduction. Now you're looking within each paragraph of what you write. So you don't do this until you've done the big picture stuff, because if you start doing this without having looked at the big picture, then you are going to lose the big picture and get mired in things that are more precise. So people always ask me, what should I do with what I learned in law school about organizing paragraphs? So you can see from the bottom of this slide, some law schools call it CREAC, some law schools call it IRAC, some law schools call it CREXAC. I think that's for explanation in the middle there. That one always seemed the hardest one to pronounce. So I don't use it that much. So what you're looking at when you are looking at your paragraphs are principally, do they do what I was taught in law school to do? That means, do they start out with either my conclusion or my point? Okay, that's how you're always going to want to start out. So here, this is a memo. So this starts out with the conclusion, Jane broke the law while she was driving and should receive a ticket. Actually, it looks a little bit like an argument too. Then after that, you're going to set out the rule. Then you're going to explain the rule in as much or as little detail as is necessary for that rule. And you all know this, that's going to vary, right? If the rule is super complicated, if it has a lot of different parts, you're going to spend more time explaining that rule. If it's really simple and straightforward and no one's going to disagree about it, you're not going to do that. It'll be a sentence or two. And then after that rule explanation, you apply the rule to the facts of your case. So this is a great way to edit your paragraphs, is to make sure that they generally still follow traditional legal writing structure. And you're going to have times where you vary it, but this is a great default. When you're editing on a paragraph by paragraph basis, you will find when you're like, oh man, I'm missing all of my points. They come at the end of the paragraphs instead of at the beginning of the paragraphs. And you know, that's the easiest editing fix ever, right? You just move it, the sentence from the end of the paragraph to the beginning of a paragraph. I do that all the time in both my own writing and when I'm commenting on other people's writing. So my general rule about paragraph length, and you're looking at that at this stage of the process as well, is 1/2 page or shorter. Okay, nobody wants to turn a page of a document and just see like text, 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 text. So that has gotten a lot harder now that there are a lot of courts that like 14-point type instead of 12-point type. And it just means you can't have that many sentences in your paragraph to meet my 1/2 page rule. But I don't think you should change the rule just because the type size is bigger. Okay, so at the start of a sentence, you're either going to have your thesis statement, this is my point, your conclusion, this is what I figured out after you asked me to research this, and then you have another option at the start of sentences, and we can go to the next slide. So transitions are your friends. When it seems like you are continuing or expanding on or relating in some other way to what you just wrote, you get to start your paragraph with a transition. You see how all of these explain, expand, emphasize what you talked about in the paragraph before. Then you can also have some that are additive, that are also further, in addition, moreover, you know, all of those kinds of examples that can also start a paragraph very effectively, because they will tell your reader what's going to come next in that paragraph. Okay, and then the third category are things that are in contrast, right? You've just described one case that you thought was really important, and now you're going to explain one that went the other way. So this is a good list. It's not exhaustive. Feel free to use them. For these reasons is really about my favorite phrase ever. I feel like it's just blood pressure lowering for your readers. It sort of just goes right into, you know, I already set out these reasons, so I'm just concluding in this paragraph. So you're thinking about that. The 3 most important parts of your document are going to be that intro, those headings, and then the first sentence of every paragraph. That's what readers' eyes will be drawn to more than anything else. So that's the middle stage of my editing process, is the paragraph level. And now we're going to look at word choice, sentence structure, all of that kind of stuff. Not proofreading yet, but editing on a sentence by sentence level. So our next slide, another one of my favorite writers and favorite writing quotes, and the second candidate for a t-shirt from today's webinar slides is it's sort of in the beginning of the third paragraph. I want one that says, when you catch an adjective, kill it. Because I am not a fan of adjectives or adverbs in mine or others' writing. So this is actually a really good story, this quote. So Mark Twain had a lengthy correspondence starting in 1880 with a 12-year-old student named D.W. Bowser, who sent him his English theme and his report card. I'm not exactly sure why, but apparently it provoked something in Twain, and the two of them wrote to each other for 4 years, and then the letters were sealed until I think it was the second one of them had passed away. So they made a big stir when they came out in the early 20th century. But this was one that has been used now many times. Another quote that Twain talks about with respect to adjectives and adverbs is he hated the word very. And he said, when you put very in your writing, just swap it out for damn, and your editor will cut it out and your writing will be better. So the big lesson here is, as legal writers, we don't have space for extra words. You know, as students, you might have been trying to grow that writing to meet the page limit when you had to write a 10-page paper. That's never what you're going to do here. The best thing you could do if you have a 10-page limit on a brief is come in under that, but still cover exactly what you need to cover. So adjectives and adverbs are almost always unnecessary to your writing. Plain, simple language is always good. Short words, brief sentences. My general sentence guide is 15 words to 25 words with super short sentences at the start of a paragraph. So at the start of a paragraph, I really go for 15 words. If you can do that, I can absolutely guarantee that your writing will be clearer. So some additional sentence editing tips. We can go to the next slide. So when you're editing a sentence, the best place to start is the beginning of the sentence. I feel like people spend a lot of time thinking about active voice, but it's hard for most of us to edit for the verb that's in the middle of the sentence and to really focus on what even it means to be active. I'm always confused about, is doing active, or is it only active when you say does? So it's a little bit hard and you can get yourself bogged down in that. So instead, Joe Williams, who's a big writing scholar, said you should always look at the first 4 or 5 words of every sentence. And if you haven't gotten to the point in the first 4 or 5 words, that's when you start editing there. So this excerpt came from a blog post that someone wrote at Schiff, and it was for our corporate clients and prospective clients, which is what most business development piece writing is for. So this one failed my brother Adam's can you read the sentence without breathing test, right? And it has, I don't know, it is a 11 word. I don't think I wrote the count. It's a lot of words before you get to the verb, which this one we will all agree is passive because it's are, right? With nothing else with it. So super easy. When you look at sentences like this, I see the words as puzzle pieces, and you can often move things around and divide them up to capture the critical stuff from your sentence so you don't lose your point, but you make it easier for your reader to understand it. So the rewrite here is, it turns into, the first one was a 21-word sentence. It turns into 2 sentences that are 14 words and 10 words. So if my math is right, it's a little bit longer, but only 3 words, but in 2 sentences, which make them clearer. So you're focusing on the subject. Someone once said you want subjects that you can generally see, hear, touch, taste, kick. I don't know if you'd really be able to kick a financial institution, but maybe, probably some of them in the actual building, and you might want to. I think a lot of us want to. So we're writing for financial institutions. You want to put your readers in your writing whenever you can anyway. So now they headline the first sentence here. Financial institutions must establish, and then you explain that both of them are critical parts. So we took the words critical, we took the words financial institutions, we took the words effective corporate governance policies, right? Most of the words in the first example are in the second example, but I think most of us would agree that the second one is clearer and punchier. And this is written, and a lot of what we as lawyers write is not for other lawyers. So they're for people in business or nonprofits or people out there in the world, and we've got to write so that they can understand what we're writing. So that is one of your big goals. So next example, same idea, same principle, but I thought it was worth repeating. This one was from a brief written for a court, so a different audience, but also an audience that doesn't have a lot of time to read long and complicated sentences. This sentence is 27 words with a 13-word subject. It was a brief asking, I think it was in California, asking for a case to get reassigned. to a special process with another judge. So the rewrite here. So super simple, right? This case is what you're talking about anyway. You've got the same words, the management challenges, and then what it requires coordinating. And then two things I want to point out here. First, the words tailor-made in that second sentence. Feel comfortable being conversational in your writing. And that's your formal legal writing, the writing that goes to courts, and the writing that goes to typical people. This is what actually distinguishes great writing from good writing, is when you come up with a way to say something that is clear and precise, but also your spin on the best way to say something. So in a lot of your writing, the other word I want you to focus on here is because. So whenever you can use the word because to connect to things, you want to do it. It has magic properties. And I'm not lying here. There's a very famous study. If you read it, it's in all sorts of marketing books, because marketing is obviously about persuasive writing, like what we do is. So it's a study that came out of a psychologist named Ellen Langer at Harvard, who had, she put a student at all these experiments are of course with students. She put a student at the copier, and she had at the copy machine, and she had another student go up and say, can I go ahead of you to make a copy? And when the other student came and just said that, like 60% of the students at the copier said, sure. They must have been like pretty nice students to do that. When the student who came up to the student at the copier said, can I go ahead of you because I have class in 5 minutes? The student at the copier said yes, 90-some% of the time. But the third situation, and this is the magic of the word because, when the student came up to the student at the copier and said, can I go ahead of you because I need to make a copy? The same number in the 90s of students at the copier said, go ahead. So it was this proof that when you put because in what you're writing, you signal something neurologically to the person you're writing to. So use it whenever you can, and you can often use it. All right, a couple of smaller writing points, but we're focusing on those first 4 or 5 words of the sentence to get your subjects good. That's going to make your verbs better, your sentences shorter, everything clearer. So one thing that comes up all the time in terms of clarity in your writing of sentences is pronouns. And I'm actually a member of a board, and the head of the organization has this great line that she uses all the time, which is never use a pronoun when the noun is in the room. I think many of us heard that from our parents. My mom hated it when I ever called her. That was always considered disrespectful in my family. So there are a few good writing fixes that you can use to clarify what you mean when you're using pronouns. So this first example, these are from non-legal writing examples. Edwin told Kenny that Dr. Wilson suspected that he cheated on the chemistry exam. Super unclear there, right? Whether it's Edwin or Kenny, who Dr. Wilson suspected cheated on the exam. So you just have to repeat the name. And again, this is an example of don't use a pronoun when the noun is in the room. So for clarity purposes, that's what you need to do there. Next example, this one is from legal writing. The plaintiff and defendants agreed that they were present at the accident scene. I could totally see myself writing a sentence like that. But the rewrite is obviously much clearer because you don't really know whether they're talking about, you might think it's the defendants, but it's not the clearest there. So you add the word all, and then you know you are referring to both the plaintiffs and the defendants. Okay, in order to write, just one more thing on the pronouns, you also really want to be careful about writing in a gender neutral fashion. And that often means, for me, it means avoiding he or she unless you are referring to someone specific and you know what their pronouns are. If you don't, you can always repeat the noun like you do in the first example here, or you can take out a pronoun and use an indefinite article like a instead. So those are always ways to do it. I don't think these days you are writing he or she first because it's not inclusive and not descriptive, and also it's super clunky in writing, so it's not an effective writing tool. I am going to stop for just 1 second before we talk about spelling and start talking about proofreading, so that anyone who has questions, please feel free to offer them up or comments. No? All right, we will go into the third part of our revising, editing, and proofreading. This one I'm sure is everyone's favorite part because we all love proofreading our own writing. And I got to tell you, I avoided this for the first 4 years of my legal writing or my legal career. I went to work at a law firm with one of my best friends from law school, and I did not turn a thing into any partner or anyone else without running it by Sheila. And she did the same. And we actually talked about all of these phases of editing together. You know, it was sort of like, does this make any kind of sense? Does it meet my purpose? Can you get my points by reading through the intro, the headings, the first sentences? And then please make sure I don't make any mistakes, because I think all of us have what is mostly an irrational fear, but a real fear that looking careless in our writing is going to tank our careers and make people not respect us. And I think it's just a super huge challenge, and especially when we're all writing more because we're on screens all the time, writing as much as we are Zooming. And I think that's a real danger. And it is much harder to proofread on a screen than it is in other forms. So we'll talk about that. So these are not actually spelling errors, right? Oh, I'm sorry, did somebody say something?
And really quickly, we can take questions.
Great.
The question is, what about using they as a singular pronoun?
I think this will be my prediction that we are within 5 years of using they as a singular pronoun. I think now there are still people who would be uncomfortable with it. Because they would think that it isn't precise. If you are referring to a particular person who uses they as their pronoun, by all means do it. But as a general rule, I wouldn't do it at this point. What you could do when you want to use they is make the noun plural. So it can be plaintiffs must, blah, 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 they need to, whatever. So, but I think within 5 years, it will be standard. So keep an eye out, but wait, would be my advice. And thank you for asking that question. So common spelling errors, none of these are mistakes. All of these are words on this chart, of course, but too often I see people swap one or another in for the other word. I just recently read a writing sample for a candidate for a summer associate candidacy who used both types of principal. And now the first principal, P-A-L, means the main thing, right? Or your principal at a school, who is your pal. And the second principal, ending in L-E, means a rule, which also ends in L-E, which is how I remember how to spell them. But anyway, this law student, I think, somehow got the idea, I don't know if it was a he, didn't know which was correct. So in a 10-page memo, he went back and forth between the two types of spelling, not in any like logical way where the PALs were for the main thing and the PLEs were for the rules, but you've got to look for things like that. So if you don't know these words, if you don't remember the differences, Please keep track of them, keep an ongoing list so that you check and don't make that kind of mistake. So one of my favorite ones was in an opinion written by a judge here in state court in Illinois on a question of willful and wanton misconduct, which is another phrase that none of us knew, right, before you went to law school, because it's not something in like common parlance. But every time the word should have been wanton, which is W-A-N-T-O-N, the judge wrote, I'm sure everybody can guess this, right? Wonton, W-O-N-T-O-N, which obviously means a kind of soup and has nothing to do with bad behavior. Maybe unless you eat like too much of the soup or something like that and it makes you sick. Anyway, that one was embarrassing, and you figure, gee, a judge made a mistake like that and didn't have anybody to pick it up. So these things happen. It got released. It made the rounds because it was just too funny not to share, right? But you don't want to be that person. So keep track of things that are difficult for you to spell. Down at the bottom here, I know you all know the difference between there and their, which is they are. We don't use they are, we don't use contractions like that in legal writing. So you're not going to have their in your legal writing principally, and then their, which is the plural possessive. Just keep track. Know that that's something you should go back to and check out. So ways to avoid these kinds of proofreading mistakes. And Laura, we can go to the next slide while I talk about them. So some of my best proofreading tips. Whitney, do we have another question?
We do, just before you dive into that. So,
sure.
As a follow-up to the they question, how do you reconcile use of they when, from an inclusive perspective, it is recommended that we use it?
I don't think that from an inclusive perspective, you need to use it for a singular person. I think they is great to use. I think that the challenge for some people is that they don't think it's clear when you use they for a single person. If the single person uses they as their pronoun, then you absolutely use it to describe that single person. But if you are using it to make a point about inclusiveness, I think you're losing something with respect to precision and clarity. And I think that's, you know, all of these things evolve, and that's what he or she was for, is it was an effort after everything that anyone had ever written, always used he for everything, right? There were no women in any formal writing. There were no women in any statutes or rules or cases. It was assumed somehow that maybe no plaintiffs were women. Who even knows that? It was an effort to be more inclusive at the time, and you know, perhaps it worked for a while. Now that doesn't describe everyone's pronouns, so it's now obsolete for that reason. So I think if you were referring to more than one person, by all means use they. If you were referring to one person who uses that pronoun, by all means use they. If you are using they to make the point that people have a number of different pronouns, I would use it with plural nouns so that it's clear. But, and my 5 years might be too long. It might be that that happens in 2 years, that people use they for singular people. So thank you again.
And one more question. What tips do you have for executive communication for attorneys at work?
So I'm not 100% sure what you mean by executive communication, but I'll think that what you're talking about is emails, maybe voicemails or other conversations. So when you are speaking with people who you are working with or working for, you always want to be respectful of their time and of their needs and of their communication style. So that means I had one law student when I was teaching a bunch of years ago who would send me 8 emails on a Sunday. let's say, and each one would ask me different, totally valid questions. And I was paid to respond to their emails and, do everything that I was doing. So I would do that. But at some point during the year, I know that I gave her the tip that when you are communicating with someone in legal practice, you can't, clog someone's inbox with 8 emails. What you do instead to communicate in a professional way is, you sit there, you gather up your questions over the course of your day or your couple days, and then you send a respectful email that starts out with, "Dear," the person's name, "I hope you had a good weekend," some indication of creating connection, a personal connection. And I think that's all the more important and all the more pervasive during the pandemic and the racial and social justice movements of this summer. And then you say, "I've done some research on this work," or "I looked into this," or "I talked to this person, and I've got 4 questions about it. Do you have a few minutes to speak with me?" So that's my preferred form of that type of communication. If you're someone who wants to, another alternative there would be to say, "Here are my 4 questions. Do you, maybe it would be better if you have a few minutes to discuss it." In responsive emails, you're going to match tone and content with the person who's writing back to you. So for example, we will have people at Schiff who always maintain the same level of formality in subsequent emails that they did in the original email. That means having a salutation, "Dear Laura," and having a "all the best," or "thank you," or "take care, Whitney," or "Julie" at the end of it. Other people get subsequently more casual over the course of exchanges. When you are communicating with someone who you are working for or is at a higher level in your organization, you are matching their tone. So that means you don't go more formal than they are at some point, but you also don't go less formal than they are at some point. One cautionary note here that I would say, because I have been burned by this so many times, be careful when you're responding to serious emails on your phone. I had this issue a few years ago when I was in denial that I needed reading glasses. And, I'd make these typos and "Yeah, you have, please forgive these typos. It's my iPhone." Nobody really forgives those typos. So I wouldn't type something that's important on your phone when you're on the fly. It always makes more sense to sit down at your computer if you can. If you have to respond, I would say, "Thanks for your email. I'm away from my computer right now. Can I please respond more fully in an hour?" Or something like that. So I hope those answer some of your questions. Another thing that I've been advising people to do, if you are writing emails, I often send them to myself first to see how they look, and then I can open them on my phone and on my computer to see if I open them and I'm "Oh man, this is way too much text or way too much bold or way too much something," because you want to make sure that they read the way you want them to read for people. Another thing to be super careful about, and this comes up in all professional environments, is be really wary of BCCs. I would not use them unless you are doing some formal communication that requires you keep people anonymous. I would be careful about forwarding things to people who are not a part of the original email or the communication. So you pay attention to all of those kinds of things. And then this is a broader point. Everybody has limited time and attention, so writing concisely is super important. After writing clearly and precisely, when you're doing legal writing, writing concisely is your 3rd biggest goal there. And for that one, I have a favorite game, which I call the 10-minute 10% game, or the 20-minute 20% game. You can guess where I'm going here. So you set the timer on your watch for 10 minutes and you copy your document into something else and you tell yourself, "I'm cutting 10% of the words." When you set that timer, it's like magic. You get less attached to every individual word, and it becomes like, your own personal video game or something. It's like, can I beat my last record? Can I do it in 8 minutes this time? So, and if that's not enough, you set it again and go for another 10 minutes and another 10%. I can guarantee you nothing gets worse when it's 10% shorter. Nothing I've ever read. And I've been reading legal writing between teaching and being at Schiff for a really long time. So, some proofreading tips before we run out of time. The best #1 proofreading tip is sleep between the time that you are done with your revising and editing and when you're going to embark on your proofreading. Everybody, I don't care if you're a night owl or a morning person, you will proofread better in the morning. That is absolutely guaranteed. The other thing is you got to trick yourself again into seeing this writing as someone else's. So things you can do about that. People have always said print if you can. That's great if you have a printer and paper at home. If you don't, though, you can copy it into another document and change the type size, or change the font, or change the spacing. I used to have our docketing department used to sit outside my office, and they would always print things on yellow paper. And when things came out on yellow, like they all looked different. And all of a sudden I was a great proofreader instead of a weak proofreader. So anything you can do to mix up your eyes is very helpful there. Another important tip is proofread the different parts of your document separately. So that means, so this is one of my favorite examples. I pulled this from an actual case that we litigated at Schiff several years ago, and nobody had clearly looked at this case caption for a bunch of years. But when I did, because I didn't know who the parties were, I didn't know what was going on, you'll see, and you'll have this in the PowerPoint, there are 5 typos in this case caption. So lesson there, read the caption separately, read the parties' names separately, read all dates and numbers separately, read citations separately, read the things you wrote when you were the most tired or burnt out or bored, or the stuff that you just hated separately. Read the stuff you copied from some other brief or document that you were using as a sample separately. So those are the best ways to do a good job proofreading. And I think, I'm happy to go to the next slide. The lessons here are things that you deny aren't going to go away over time. So you're always better off to face your personal writing challenges. We all have them, and we're all working hard, even after, many years of writing, to get better. So keep a list of the things that you need to work on. If you feel like you're always skipping that first step of the revising process, tell yourself you have to slow down and go back to that. Ask yourself, is my document meeting my reader's needs? Is my tone appropriate? Is my organization appropriate? So know which parts you're better at and which parts you are worse at, and keep that. You can use the notes function on your phone or anywhere else that you have that you just look at to know what is impairing yourself from creating a super polished and professional and high quality final product. So the last couple slides here are just some resources that I recommend all the time. My favorite one is still the first one, and most of them address the sentence editing and proofreading parts of this presentation. A couple of them are bigger, like Point Made by Ross Guberman or Making Your Case, that are really about effective, persuasive writing. So thank you all so much. Does anyone have any other final questions? All right, so this is some final words of encouragement from Maya Angelou, who also has a ton of amazing quotes about legal writing. It is super scary to start something new, and it's super scary to do something that you don't feel that confident about. But the only way to get more confident about it is to keep doing it. And you don't necessarily get rid of the fear, but you might, on the other end of it, have some real confidence about what you've done. And, I'd love to be as accomplished I'll never be as accomplished as any of the people whose quotes I use today, but I like to be more accomplished. And the only way to do that is to keep on writing. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Julie. I don't have more questions, so I think that will do it for today's webinar. But is this your contact information where everyone can reach you?
It is, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn if that's easier for you.
Perfect. And for all attendees today, you will receive a thank you email with this PowerPoint attached. And we thank you for attending this webinar today.
Thanks so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.